Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We're discussing a really profound topic today, and that is art and cognition. How does art work inside your mind? And what function, not only what function it serves the function of actually making your entire worldview concretely real to you in an emotional way, visceral way. And the question that we are going to talk about is, how does it do that? How does it do that for visual arts? How does it do that for literature? And how does it do that for music? All right, so that's what we're talking about. We're going to start with Rob and then Joia and Sherri. They'll be talking about this topic. And then we're going to, each of the panelists will get to pose a question for the panel, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, after which we'll do breakout rooms, and then takeaways as usual. All right, Rob, take it away.
Okay. Well, in prepping for this, one of the things I looked at is that she, especially I think at the very beginning of this chapter, she uses and we've seen this before, she uses the term esthetician a lot. So I looked up the word, I thought it's a little bit of an odd, it does not turn not used a lot anymore. And I think there's a reason for that, because I looked it up on Google here, and it gives you dictionary definition. And one of the senses it gives you, which notes is a North American usage, exclusively North American usage, is esthetician is a term for a beautician. So someone who does hair, makeup, and skin care or whatever. So yeah, I think that's US and Canada only, but that's why I think the term isn't used in a philosophical context so much anymore. But what's more interesting actually is the first part of the first definition, the more old-fashioned definition. And it's a person who is knowledgeable about the nature and appreciation of beauty, especially in art. Now, I thought it was interesting that it's mentioned beauty in general, of which art is one category. And I mention that because in this chapter especially, there's a lot of discussion. The subject she begins with is, what kinds of objects would be properly classified as works of art. And basically, and she's very concerned in this chapter with what is art and also with what is not art, with what's not doesn't belong in the category of art. And I think there's a few things in there I might disagree with or might have quibbles with. But I think we need to keep in mind this idea that of the aesthetics is a field that studies beauty or or the issue of sense of life in general, and of which art is one category. And maybe you can say in a modern context, you can say fine art is a subcategory of art. There's lots of, an illustrator who does illustrations for advertisements is an artist. But there's this differentiation, sometimes very snobbishly done, between the illustrators and the fine arts people. Or at least there used to be this very snobbish differentiation. So I think we should keep that in mind going through here. We talk about what is art and what isn't art. I think you can get too tangled up in that. Now, I think the reason why she's so focused on that is she was writing this. This is 1971. By the way, this is
Rob. Let's do one thing. Can you move closer to the mic, or can you move
Sure.
mic closer to you?
Yeah. How's this? Is it better?
That's much better.
Okay. She wrote this in 1971, which I think is interesting because the introduction to this book is written in 1969. Everything else is written in basically 1962 through 69 to 1968, I think. And so it's clear that this anthology was put together in 1969. And then she came on a couple of years later and she wrote this chapter. And it mentions there's a revised second edition that was published in 1975. And I think that's when this chapter was put in here. So this is later than everything else. But I think the reason why she is writing so much about what's not art is because she was writing at the heyday of modernism in art. And this is,
Rob, let me interrupt you for a second. For people who are just coming for this particular meetup and who are not familiar with, can you just recap very quickly what art is in her view? Maybe take 2 minutes to talk about that, and then we can talk about how it works.
Okay, so the idea is that art for her is, she talks about what is the function served by art. And the function served by art is to provide a concretized experience of your broadest ideas, implicitly held ideas about the nature of man and the nature of the universe. And that's what she talks about. She calls those, she has a technical term, she calls them metaphysical value judgments. But metaphysical basically means pertaining to the nature of the world, the nature of the universe. And the value judgment means your ideas about what the way the world is and how the world works as they apply to your values, as they apply to action and what they imply for how you live your life in this world.
Excellent.
So,
I think that was perfect. So let me just elaborate. So what she holds is that, what Ayn Rand holds is that, human beings need philosophy. They need a view of the world, view of who they are and what they need to do. And that is critically important. But in addition to holding it in conceptual terms, they need to be able to experience it in emotional, direct way. And that's what art gives you. Art gives you that experience of actually, what would it be like living your philosophy? And that is the power of, go ahead.
and a big point she makes is that you may not be aware of having a philosophy of life. You may never have thought of it in explicit terms, but implicitly you have, arrived at certain conclusions. You've had a whole range of experiences, and implicitly those have summed themselves up. You have an implicit outlook you have on life. There are certain things that you regard as being normal and permanent aspects of life, and certain things you regard as being abnormal, accidental, temporary parts of life, and that that has big implications for how you approach the world.
Excellent.
So
go ahead.
when she's talking about art, she's trying to that's the context actually for her talking about what is and isn't art, because what she said, she's thinking about what she's identified is this basic function that art serves in life. And so what she's trying to say is, which says, what is art? What classifies as the major branches of art? She's trying to connect them to things that serve this basic function of concretizing, providing with a concrete experience of concrete emotional level experience of experiencing your basic view of the universe and of man. And that's why she's including some things. That's also why she's excluding other things. And part of the context, though, for this is that she's also writing at the heyday of modernism art. And modernism was really the antipode in many ways of that whole theory that we just discussed, that whole idea of art as concretizing a view of the world, because modernism in the sort of strict early 20th century version of it that was very dominant in the middle of the 20th century, when she was coming up with a lot of these ideas, it was very much the idea that well, before anything, it was based primarily on the rejection of representationalism. So the function of art is not to represent the world. It's not to say anything about the world. It's not to represent objects that are recognizable. It's the interplay of shapes and forms and that sort of thing. And if you want a really, really good critique, she doesn't go into it very much, but if you want to read it, I think is one of the most interesting critiques of modernism, published not long after this essay in the 70s, was Thomas Wolfe, called The Painted Word. And his critique of modernism was that a lot of modernism, especially at that time, was about commenting on other theories of modernism.
Other theories of art.
Yeah, other theories of art and other theories, and oftentimes one version of modernism commenting on another theory of modernism, and not so much about what's actually in the painting. And he has this great section at the end where he says, the museums have it all wrong. They put the painting up on a big canvas, and then on the side they have this little plaque with a little explanation with words explaining it. It says, to really capture the spirit of this kind of art, you should have the painting reproduced in this little plaque off to the side as a mere illustration, and the words of the art critics and the art theorists should be projected up onto the walls, because that's what's really important. So it gives you an idea of I think it's a very interesting critique. And there's a movie that was done called Art School Confidential about 10 years ago. It's kind of now this is another second weird movie recommended by me, but it's about a kid going through art school, and it's very much it's a movie adaptation basically of The Painted Word, where what you say, the students are presenting their artworks, and what you say about your artwork is more important. There's one guy who has like a piece of silly string on a cardboard, on a piece of cardboard, but he has a great theoretical statement about it, and that's more important than the fact that it's just a piece of silly string on cardboard. So that's sort of a widely that's a good way to go for a critique of modern art. But she was basically fighting back against that because it's doing the opposite of what she says art should do. So the last thing I would say is there's basically sort of two things happening in this chapter. This very long, it's a long chapter. It's as long almost as the first 3 chapters combined. There are two things happening. So the one is what Ayn Rand is trying to do, that having created this theory of art and this idea of the role of art, the function it performs for a human being, she wants to then connect each of the different forms and media of art, music and sculpture and painting and performing arts, etc. She wants to connect each of them to that theoretical framework to say, well, which exactly in what way do each of these things serve this cognitive need that we have? In what way do they correspond to different needs of man's consciousness? Different needs for him to hold his basic view of the world in his mind. So that's the big thing she's trying to do. Now, the second thing she's doing in this chapter is that Ayn Rand has a lot of opinions about art. And she wants to share a lot of these very concrete opinions. So she has this idea that, wallpaper shouldn't be representational. It shouldn't have patterns that try to represent anything in nature. And which I personally think is completely wrong. I'm a big fan of William Morris, and this is a guy whose wallpaper was all oak leaves making a pattern. So I just want to urge people. I think you should take the first category of things in that first goal of the article. Take that more seriously and pay more attention to that. And the second part, which is Ayn Rand has a lot of different opinions about things that she feels strongly about that she wants to share.
You get to know her more.
Yeah, well, you get to know her more, but you should also, feel free to take those maybe a little less written in stone. They're more personal than philosophical.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Next up is Joia, followed by Sherri. Joia, go ahead.
Thanks. And I want to thank Rob, because this perfectly sets up what it is that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to say I'm really glad that I'm here for our discussion of this chapter, because I think this is simultaneously my favorite and my least favorite chapter in this whole book. Because when I read this chapter, I get this sense of this is not at all how I experience art. What is she talking about? And sometimes I feel that with frustration, and sometimes I feel it with curiosity simultaneously. So this chapter, it at times frustrates me and at times just utterly intrigues me. But I think it's absolutely fascinating to explore the broad question that she starts out with. This is a chapter about art and cognition. So this question of how does art, what does art do for our cognitive faculties? How does art work, as Shrikant put it, in our minds? And then what does it do for our lives broadly, beyond just the internal experience we have? How do we even take that internal experience and use it in a way that's valuable for our lives as a whole? And one of the things that she makes a point to say in this chapter is that we don't have anything like an objective theory of art. There's a long interlude, you could say, in this chapter that's all about music, where she tries to put forward a kind of beginning interpretation of what music is all about. But she makes a point to say that we have no objective theory of music. And I think you could extend that to say that we don't really have an objective theory of art. But she offers, I do believe, some really interesting leads. And so I wanted to read just a paragraph from the chapter, the paragraph that to me is most interesting in terms of the leads that I think Ayn Rand has for what art is all about. So talking about this fact that we don't have this objective theory of art, she has this chapter. She says, if such calculations were made and reduced to a manageable number of equations, i.e. of principles, and I should point out here, she's talking about music specifically, which I think is why she's talking about equations, because of the mathematical nature of music, although even perhaps that's interesting parenthetically. At least I think of music more about even proportions than equations, but go back to this. So a manageable number of equations, i.e. of principles, we would have an objective vocabulary of music. It would be a mathematical vocabulary based on the nature of sound and on the nature of man's faculty of hearing, i.e. on what is possible to the faculty. The aesthetic criterion to be derived from such a vocabulary would be integration, i.e. the range or complexity of the integration achieved by a given composition. Integration, because it is the essence of music as distinguished from noise. Range, because it is the measure of any intellectual achievement. And this I find absolutely fascinating as a lead to think about how integration, how range functions in how we experience art and find art valuable. So that's what I wanted to bring to the table. And also the question that I personally find it incredibly interesting to hear the different, I guess you'd call them idiosyncrasies about how people experience art. As I said, I don't believe we have, as human beings, anything close to an understanding of how art affects people universally, or even in a way that perhaps is statistically significant for a majority of people. But then it's also just fascinating all of the personal and idiosyncratic ways that art affects people differently. So I wanted to bring that up as a question for the group. I would love to hear about different participants' experiences of art, and perhaps especially the ways that you might observe that you experience art in a way that is different from the way perhaps even a majority of other people might experience that same work of art.
Thank you, Joia. Sherri, you're next.
Okay, great question, Joia. I like that. I'm with Rob in thinking this is a big, long, detailed chapter. And so the last thing I probably should do is bring in even more material, but that's what I'm going to do. By way of example, so I wrote an article called Architecture and Sense of Life back. It's actually in 22 years ago, which I just realized that about an hour ago, which is slightly shocking to me. And the reason I mention this is because she talks about visual arts a little bit. We talked about this last time, that sometimes she's using a bit of a shorthand or a little telegraphing, where she'll give you the basic example, like maybe paintings with bright colors, and then she jumps to the conclusion, and you don't get, it's essentially like a math problem when you're supposed to do a math proof, but you don't show your work. So sometimes we have that going on. So and in this article, she just refers people to her book on the Fountainhead for architecture. But in the Fountainhead, understanding how it goes from A to B to C, how it actually functions cognitively, it's not discussed in that book. It's architecture is not the subject, it's the backdrop of that book. So I'm going to read you just a couple of paragraphs from the article that I wrote that gets into a little bit more about how architecture specifically brings you from point A to point B.
So Sherri, I just want to say that this is a great idea.
Okay.
Because so far we've just talked about that, okay, there is something that she did on music, but there isn't much. So I think architecture, let's just go through one example of how we can do that. And, you have the article, we have Louis Sullivan, so we can really do a good job of that.
Yeah.
So people can understand actually how, and we will, later on, we're going to get into how she, applies it to literature. So we're going to have a really solid example of that. But if we can do architecture, no matter how long it takes, I think it's worth it. So thank you. Go ahead.
Yep. And also after this, Rob is going to do one on music as well. He's got a little.
But that fits in with.
It fits in, so it'll fall in after mine.
Perfect.
So these are a few paragraphs pulled out of my article from April 1998, which makes me feel really old. The reason architecture seems more difficult to evaluate is that it is non-representational. As Ayn Rand points out, it does not produce a recreation of reality. It does not show us, for example, a building in the shape of a human figure, nor does it attempt to directly imitate man's natural environment. A column supporting the roof of a house, for example, is not a recreation of a tree. Instead, Architecture creates an entirely new environment for man to live in. This, however, is the key to the artistic power of architecture. Architecture does what no other art can do. All other art forms recreate some portion of the world, a single human figure, a two-dimensional scene on a canvas. Only architecture can create a total environment, one that literally surrounds us. The architecture creates a man-made idealized world, an environment created by the architect to fit a kind of life he sees as proper to man. Architecture conveys a view of man indirectly, not by projecting an image of man himself, but by projecting a proper environment for man to live in. A way to grasp this point is by analogy to landscape painting. A landscape may not portray any actual human figure, but it still conveys a view of the world in which man lives. A scene that is dark and stormy, for example, the paintings of Joseph Turner, can imply that the world is a dangerous, inhospitable, malevolent universe. A scene that is sunlit and visually dramatic, for example, the paintings of Albert Bierstadt, implies the world is an inviting, hospitable, and benevolent. Architecture conveys a sense of life through a similar process. It creates a real physical environment that is specifically designed for the human habitation and use. Architecture and sculpture in this respect represent opposite extremes. A sculpture shows only the human figure, perhaps with a few other objects, or one must infer from the figure the type of world that a man lives in. Architecture, by contrast, provides the world from which one can infer the kind of man who is to live in it. This is the reason why historically there has been such a close relationship between architecture and sculpture. The architect aims to create the ideal environment, and the sculpture aims to furnish a representation of the ideal man to live within it. And we didn't pull up any examples of, I don't have visual examples because Rob will be, well, but they're not going to show up on this screen.
Oh, okay.
But one of the things that I talked about in this particular article was one that probably everybody here, if I just mention falling water, everyone knows exactly, you have an image in your head. And what I describe in that article is the way that every part of architecture, the structure, the choice of materials, the colors, all of those elements reflect that architect's sense of life and reflects whether a world is knowable or not. So if you all imagine that image of falling water, you probably can visualize that central flagstone mass, and then all of these sand-colored concrete cantilevers that come off in different directions. What's happening there is you have this very ordered set. You can almost see visually how the structure is working. You can see that the mass of stone is holding all those cantilevers from literally tipping into the river. And by contrast, I put up a different article, a different building in this article, but you probably all know Frank Gehry's art museum in Bilbao, Spain, where you've got these curving shapes. Most of Frank Gehry's buildings, you have no sense of what floor is what floor. You don't have a sense of how the structure is supporting itself. And that's reflecting a different sense of life. One is reflecting that the world is knowable, and the other that the world is almost magical or unknowable. I think that's a pretty good beginning part of, we can talk more in detail. We can even bring this up at a different point in time too. I just want to make sure we leave time for music stuff that's coming too. So there we go. And where are we going next? Back to you, Rob?
Rob. Yes. So Rob, you wanted to do a piece on music, right?
Well, unless everyone wants to talk about what we've gone through already first. So if you want to do a little
A
bit of that
little
first, then I can
Q&A
do this.
here.
You want to do a Q&A before going into that? Okay. So folks, give me just a second here. It's time. You can ask questions at this point. Just go ahead and type an exclamation mark in Zoom or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions at this point. And then we're going to go into music, and then we're going to do breakout rooms followed by takeaways. Are there any questions? Okay, in that case, how about, okay, let's start with Jonathan. Jonathan, go ahead.
Yes, hi, I've got a question. So it's somewhat related to this topic. I mean, it's related to everything we've been speaking about so far. So I did read most of this chapter. I didn't get into the end. One of the earlier things she said is, so I mean, this is a repeat of what she said earlier, but art teaches man how to use his consciousness. It conditions or stylizes man's consciousness by conveying to him a certain way of looking at existence. And, you know, it brought up the example of a painting with an apple, and like the apple, your visual field is in a way essentialized. The artist does that for you. He picks out those most relevant parts of the apple, and that helps train your eye to see things. And I was thinking about that. And then the other thing I was thinking about is, and this is where the question is if art has this purpose and it's more than just entertainment, does that have any implications for the way we should approach art? Like typically when I've approached art, it's been similar in the way that I've approached, say, watching a TV show, which is a kind of passive process. So I'm curious if anyone on the panel has thoughts on the implications for how we approach art, given this idea that she's got.
That's great. Let me first talk about the example of the apple. And Rob and I were talking about this beforehand earlier in the week. And we wanted to bring up, and this is something I'd like you all to go investigate, to really understand how it is that art is helping you cognitively. If you look at, and she uses apples, but I'm going to change to grapes. If you look at the grapes of the Dutch masters, these still life paintings where you've got flowers or fruit or things like that, look for ones that have grapes, and look specifically for ones that have grapes that look just insanely delicious, like they're bursting with juice. And what you'll notice is many of those Dutch masters are able to paint the grapes so that you can see through the skin of the grape to the cell structure underneath, and you can see it's just absolutely ready to burst with juice. And you can see many times you'll see a little of the must, a little of that milky white, almost velvety fluff that's on the edges of the grapes. They do grapes like grapes don't actually grow. And that's a way that's happening. What they're showing you is the things that make a grape, and they're showing it in an exaggerated form to all of its grape glory. The ultimate grape glory in these little tiny details. That's a way of explaining how that cognitive part works. It's teaching you to notice what makes a thing that particular thing. A grape, an apple is an apple. That sort of, it's helping you identify at a higher level the thing that makes that what it is. And often it's simply because that is, it's not that the artist is thinking, you know what, the world doesn't know what a grape is, let me show them. No, for them, generally, it's something that even at their sense of life, they see some of that element in a grape, and they're exaggerating it in that work of art. And then your other question was about how to view art. And I'm going to take this from a little bit different perspective. One of the most interesting bits of art I've ever studied, and I've tried to teach in children, is the original cave paintings. And if you look at them, there's even in the last 10 or 15 years, they've been finding these cave paintings. I'm sure you've all seen them. They, sometimes it's a hand where they blew pigment over their hand, and it's the outline, like a little child. Not if you guys know cave paintings. Okay. Most often, if you look at cave paintings, you'll see that they are beasts. And you'll notice this is something that Sandra Shaw gets into in one of her lectures. But more research has proven that this is even more widespread. It's something that early humans were using as examples of how to hunt, you'll notice the details of the animals. They're showing these animals in a running format. And the more that the artists who were drawing these animals, the more realism that they got, the more they learned about the animal that provided them with sustenance. But the thing that really intrigues me from when I learned about them in art history classes, versus when I really dug into it more deeply later, is in order to see these paintings, in order to create them, early man had to crawl through these little tiny cave holes. This wasn't just, we're all thinking a cave is an opening in the rock, you just stroll on in, standing upright. No, you actually have to crawl through these tiny little crevices to get deep into the cave. And of course, you're deep into the cave, there's no light in there. So in order to create these works of art, they had to bring their own light and their own pigments. And often they were painted really, really high up on the ceilings. So it was difficult to create as well. And you think about what use that had when you understand the difficulty of getting to this place, you start to get a better sense this was an important element in their civilization. They would crawl through this difficult process to bring their pigments and their paints and their light with them, stand way up high on tiptoe or mounds of dirt to make these drawings up on the ceiling. But then the biggest thing to me is you have to remember we're looking at them in still photographs where all the light is even. That's not how they would have witnessed them. They would have witnessed them by flickering firelight. So when you think about these cave paintings and you think of they're in flickering firelight, well, all of a sudden, those beasts feel like they're moving across the ceiling. It's a totally different kind of experience than the still picture that we look at today. And you get a sense that for these people, these early humans, that would have been like watching a field of wildebeest crossing the plains. It would have felt that way to them. It was something that really taught them about the creatures that they would have been hunting.
I want to build on that. I think our current approach to art means, again, I study these great ideas, from great books, and they track the progress of each of the concepts. And the concept of art in olden times was actually far more powerful than the concept now. Now, art is kind of equated with entertainment. Like many centuries of people would just rebel against that. So I'm going to make that point, okay, of the function art served in lives of people. So for example, regarding cave paintings, one of the greatest observations I've heard is from Jacob Banowski. And he asked the question, why are these cave paintings always in these remote places? They are not near place of habitation. So he said, look, they served a function, a crucial function. They were almost that, it had almost a religious quality to them. So a young boy, when he came of age and was ready to go hunting, would be led into this deep cave that he had never seen before. And then suddenly the leader, the people who are doing the hunting would light the flashing thing and point it to the ceiling. And suddenly out of darkness will appear these animals and scenes of hunting. So they were basically teaching mechanisms. The whole purpose was to imprint in the mind of this child that this is what you need to do. These are the dangers out there. This is how you do hunting. This is how you need to band together, and to communicate that in a very powerful way. So it was a tool for living. It was part of their culture. It was part of their religion, because that was the most important thing that they did, the hunt. That the fact that they had to depend on each other. When you are attacking a bear, you can see how dangerous it is, and you can defeat it if you work together like this. And all of that is being demonstrated. So that's one example. Fast forward to the Greek times. You look at the plays; those were important events in the culture, the life of the culture. They provided moral guidance. They brought up the crucial issues that people faced. And it was a way to kind of remind themselves of their core values, core virtues in a dramatized form. That's what they did. Look at, David standing outside of in the town square. What kind of view of, and it was a symbol of Florence. What is Florence? And how does it face the world? How should a person face the world? So it is training. Look at music, the beautiful music of Mozart or Beethoven. What kind of demands? What kind of mental operation is possible? What kind of creativity is possible? Same thing with Indian classical music. What kind of improvisation is possible to you? That is being communicated. You said, don't. So it is not it was definitely, like, for example, in case of Indian classical music, the singer sang with the face to the audience, because he was singing to God. It's basically trying to connect to the deepest part of you and doing it with the fullest ability that you have of expressing through this amazing mechanism that we have. And that is what the purpose of listening to the art was, to rise up in functioning of your consciousness to that level, whether it was in visual arts, whether it was literature or music. And that is the function of art. What has happened is that what we have currently is kind of a much more kind of lower version of entertainment. Now, though it is called entertainment, when you actually look at response of people, they actually get the same thing out of it. They are still it's the kind of the highbrow art which has left, but the common art which is actually consumed by people, like movies, you will see the same things happening and same functions being served. But fantastic question, Jonathan. All right, next up, I lost the track here, is going to be Jairo, followed by Judith. Jairo, what's your question?
Hello. Yes, I agree with Shrikant about maybe trying to bring it down from highbrow museum art down to the folk art and folk music and folk architecture, and even to Barry Kennedy's idea of that he paints, and that's his blueprint, and he writes poetry, and that's like the, what is it called, the, like when you're about to create something, you write down the outline. And and then he goes out and builds something out of it. So I guess the ultimate art would be then architecture, because we can live in it. And maybe music, I think of it as to like while you're working, you can keep yourself from being bored. And so you sing along or something, or it could be for dancing too.
Thank you, Jairo. I mean, one thing, just clarification. I mean, I think the highbrow art, it just pretends to be highbrow. It's actually very low. I think the challenge that you have of actually creating an art that moves people, that serves the function of capturing their entire view of life, that is quite a tall order. And it is, so highbrow is, I think, misnamed as high. Next up is Judith.
Okay, I'm going to challenge the discussion here, and
please
add a question to it.
Sure.
So I don't know if you're familiar with Cirque du Soleil.
I am.
You are. Okay. So,
and I think Rob and Sherri, you're also familiar, right?
Very much so.
Very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Because last night I was watching the making of Ka Extreme Cirque du Soleil. So behind the scenes of that. And to me, it was extremely moving. Well, just watching the behind the scenes, and seeing some of the things. But they tell a story that it's literature, it's music, it's visual, it's architecture. It's three-dimensional. The amount of scientific and technical things that go into the production, but the amount of imagination of the artists that are the experts in these different fields, or maybe visionary, and then employ the experts to execute things that just as a member of the audience, your mind would just be stretched. It would be like it defies your senses. It challenges them. It's like, this is not possible. And it tells a story that makes you think, and it's extremely immersive. The music just in every way, shape. I mean, there's architecture. You'd have to kind of see it, I guess, to know. So my question is, this kind of art is collaborative. It's a vision that grows and builds among different people. Everybody gets input, and then everybody needs to make it come together. And huge numbers of people need to make it to come together to produce such a thing. And it stimulates imagination. I think it serves, all those purposes. I don't think it's just entertainment. I think it's more than that. And I'm blown away by, the commitment and everything that goes behind it. But I guess what my question is, if you could tell me how you feel the collaborative aspect, the great number of people it takes. And it's not like building the pyramids, because that's what I thought when I watched it. It's like, okay, so somebody thought, we'll build the pyramids, or we'll do a cathedral, and you have expert painter or something, or, the architects, or the people that know how to put the stones together. It's far more than that, because there's artistic vision in every aspect of it. And each talent brings that to a final piece of work. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Excellent question, Judith. Rob or Sherri?
Well, I think what Judith is challenging is actually the specific line from, in my version, it's on page 61, where she's talking about performance art and says, without this base, and she's talking about the base of the other arts, literature and things. She says a performance may be entertaining, as in such fields as vaudeville or the circus, but it has nothing to do with art. I have a feeling that's
aerials
and
or an
which, oh, you can't see it. But in the margins, I've actually wrote Cirque du Soleil because I agree with you. It is the Cirque du Soleil has taken the art form of what was once circus entertainment and acts, and has made it. It's a combination of literature, because yes, there's story, there's music, and every performance, the music is played live. I don't know if everybody knows that. Yeah. So there's the music there's the visuals, there's the costumes, Every single element, there is art to every part of it. It's kind of like opera, which is both music and story, but far more. They are.
I think it really combines the apparatus with dance.
Yeah.
Like it's going to be a dance, except you're going to be doing it hanging from straps from the from the ceiling
And telling a story.
Yeah, doing apparatus.
Yeah.
But you know, we have to remember that that's not what the circus used to be like. I mean, it was really a radical thing when Cirque du Soleil came in and did that. They bring a sort of almost a surrealist bit of a sense to it, but which kind of makes sense from you contortionists and people doing things.
It works that way.
That are very unusual for the human body, but they do have this very integrated vision, and each one has a director. So they have an integrated vision where they take the music and they make it work with the various different acrobatic arts, and each performer brings their own skills that they're specifically recruited for, and they have some sort of storyline that ties it all together. So yeah, they've created a new art form, I think, in a way, or a variation on a new variation on our art form.
And when you think about the number of different artists and elements that come together, yes, it's really an inspiring, huge display of creative talent that goes together to it. But it's a little like what you see in a symphony orchestra. You've got a director and you have all these performers who have spent decades perfecting their craft, and they're all coming together in agreement for one ultimate goal of that performance, having that impression, that theme that runs through it.
Well, the analogy I was going to use was architecture.
Oh,
because
yeah.
you know, you haven't necessarily designed the lights, you haven't necessarily designed
That's
the
true.
carpets or the wallpaper or whatever. You know, there's all sorts of elements going in that are coming where you're relying on craftsmen. And sometimes you go choose a craftsman. It's like, here's a metal worker. He really knows how to do. I really like his work. So you're choosing all these different craftsmen who have spent years perfecting their skills, and then bringing that in together and making it all work together.
Excellent question. Next up is Lloyd, Joe, and Jonathan. Lloyd, go ahead.
All right. I just wanted to bring up the fact that I thought Ayn Rand dismisses that art and the art community industry rewards newness. She seems to eliminate that. A lot of the ways to make a name for yourself is to do something new. So, for example, you mentioned grapes. And in his painting of Bacchus, Caravaggio, who is considered a master, paints grapes as decaying, reflecting man's mortality, which was something new. I mean, at that point, there was only, the robust way to paint grapes. And he thought, well, I'll make Bacchus as somehow some debauchery element of it, and shows grapes in a new light as decaying, reflecting man's mortality. Certainly decay is a part of man. It's not some foreign concept. So newness is important, and there are more than one way to paint grapes. You don't just have to paint them as robust. They could be decaying.
Yeah. And again, every one of those, every artist is gonna, if you take every artist who's ever painted grapes, every one is gonna have a different view of how it's to be painted. And that's all reflecting their sense of life and the message they're putting forth in their work.
Well, I think, again, we have to remember the context here is it was the era of modernism, and I think what you have in mind is where being new was the only thing that there was to recommend something, because it was something that had, it was something different from what had been done before. And I think specifically with modernism, there was this trend where the newness often was in the elimination of something that had previously been considered necessary in art. So I remember reading a collection of beatnik poetry. This is, from the 60s. It's probably about the same time. And there was one guy whose big innovation was that he wrote an entire essay with no punctuation. All right, so I'm going to eliminate punctuation, and that's what's going to make my essay great. Right, so it's like, well, but why would that make it better? Eliminating punctuation, why is that somehow the elimination of something that's traditionally there would in and of itself provide a lot of value? And as I recall it, I didn't think it did provide much value. So
It'd be hard to comprehend.
it created a few problems to get rid of punctuation. But yeah, that's the sort of thing she had in mind, where there'd be this a stunt or gimmick of, hey, let's take something that's traditionally in art or literature and let's just remove that. Let's write it. Somebody else did like an entire thing without the letter E. Wrote something without using the letter E. So let's that guy went on to a great career in Silicon Valley, where all these all these companies would the name of their product would be Grinder, and something like these companies that would leave out the E in the end. So it's just that, I think that's the sort of thing she had in mind. She's talking about newness.
Yeah. I mean, I think what she's saying is that newness just for the sake of newness is useless. Where you're just trying to say that it is different, but if it is a genuine, there is a limitless scope for coming up with new things. And Circus du Soleil is a great example. Circus du Soleil is a great example of that. That somebody created a new art form, something new. You take a base of a circus and combine it with, a level of music, level of storytelling, and visuals that are completely, off the scale. It happens all the time with things like music. Beethoven did music which was new, which did not exist. Mozart did the same thing. Each person kind of breaks new grounds, makes things, and those are extremely valuable. But the standard is not just that it is new, but that it is identifying something new about the human experience, human consciousness, and building it into art. And providing greater value. Next up is going to be Jonathan. Joe, go ahead.
So this is just going to be a very basic question, is that, so because I'm still trying to delineate what Ayn Rand is actually considering art and what she doesn't consider to be art. And one of the things that I was kind of trying to put into context is, how does maybe the economics of it play into the idea of what she is considering art and what she doesn't consider art? Because is there a luxury aspect of it, in the sense of modernism is more of a luxury and therefore it's not considered art in her terms, or not? I mean, is there an economic way of thinking about this? That's what I'm trying to, because the question of value and what actually drives art is seemingly like she's saying, she's criticizing modernism from what I understand. Therefore, is there an economic component to this?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think economics is important in art all along, but I don't think it gets into what her definition of what is included in art and what isn't. She's more interested in whether it can hold, whether it can project a sense of life that's cohesive and complete enough to qualify, really. So she's considering maybe the decorative arts as less, and she's kind of fallen in the lines of what is considered fine arts versus decorative arts in, say, the history of art. But I don't, and economics is through everything, of course, but I don't think it's in I don't think it has a part to do with what she's considering art or not.
So there's no utility function, essentially, is what it...
Utility function.
Yeah, she actually has this view, very strong view, that art is non-utilitarian. All art is non-utilitarian.
And that's
Except,
why
of course,
she's architecture.
that she makes the exception for arts if it's got, it obviously has a utilitarian function.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next up is Jonathan.
Hey, again, I just want to actually pick up where Joseph left off, which is this idea of art as not being utilitarian. That's one thing that confused me, and I'm wondering if it's in the definition of how she's using utilitarian or how I'm thinking about it, because at the start, it seemed like the way I understood what was being said is art is an end in itself. It serves no other purpose. It's almost this thing that you just do for its own sake. And then later on, I started understanding, okay, it does serve a purpose. It serves a purpose for consciousness, which also then serves a purpose for survival. And so I was kind of confused there. Like, it seems like it is utilitarian in a sense that you do use it for living. It's essential for living. So is that just in the way, what am I getting caught up on here when I'm not understanding that?
It's a purpose purposeful and has utilitarian purpose for your brain, but it's not something you physically use to, you're not making coffee with it. It's not something that you use in a daily life. It's not.
I think it's interesting, a little bit of language there, that utilitarian sort of implies useful, but useful in a very concrete way.
Yeah.
Right. So it implies that useful for opening a can. Right.
Useful for something you put in a tool.
Yeah, it's a tool. It's something. It implies that it's just a tool. Now, and there's mentions in there very briefly in passing that, and the idea of industrial design, which I find very interesting, which is you can have something be a tool and also have it be beautiful. Hold up your pen, your pencil.
Yes. My Christmas gift here. I don't know if you can see. It's
Yes.
Made out of concrete. And these are, and Jane will notice she's an architect. These are, each level here is a topographical map. So that's a hilltop there. And it feels very fun to hold on to. The edges are a little bit sharp. But it's a mechanical pencil made out of concrete. But it's also funny.
She's nuts about concrete.
Yeah, my thesis was about concrete, so of course, and my earrings are actually concrete too. But anyway, so those are just funny little artistic elements to things, but they're not. The pencil's functional.
So pencil is utilitarian in the sense you use it for a very direct material purpose. It can also have an aesthetic aspect to it. Oh yeah, you're showing your other pencil.
Yeah,
she's got quite a collection of.
Yeah, so this one is copper, solid copper. It's quite heavy, and it's all finished in this all at once. You can't actually see that it actually opens up. You can see it.
It opens up like magic.
But when it's all put together, it's finished to the point where it looks like it's one solid piece. I have a collection of pencils.
Okay, I can't resist.
We're getting sidetracked here. I'm sorry.
But I think it's the you say something utilitarian means that it's useful in this very direct and delimited and concrete way, whereas art has a function. So art has a function, but it's not utilitarian. So it's just the difference in language between two things. The function is something that's in a broader and less direct, more psychological sense.
Yeah. I just
sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I jump in and say something? I want to jump in and say that Ayn Rand often uses the analogy of fuel. She talks that art is fuel for man's consciousness or man's spirit. So I think that maybe gets to the sense of what the utility or the function is of art. But she will say that beyond that use as fuel, it serves no purpose. The purpose of art is to experience the work of art. So in that sense, she talks about it as being an end in itself. The purpose is not necessarily didactic or educational to teach you something. It's to have that experience, but the experience itself is a fuel that allows you to live life in a better, more flourishing way.
Thank you. Sherri, I cannot resist this. When she says concretize, you don't have to make everything out of concretes like pencils and earrings. That's not what she's saying. No, sorry. But on
That's the concrete.
Okay.
Sherri has a concrete sense of concrete. If you go with that pun.
Okay. So I actually I've never liked that term, kind of distinguished, kind of utilitarian. Against this, I'm much more along the lines of how Louis Sullivan thinks about it, is that everything that you do has to be not only functional, but it also has to have an emotional character, kind of emotional feel to it. Just like a building, it has to be functional, but it has to have an emotional feel to it. And so I don't see this as a distinction. I mean, the art is focused on doing something for your consciousness, and that is a utility. It's a crucial part of that. So I don't think it's a useful distinction. So anyway, Rob, how about doing the piece on music, and then we will do.
Okay.
We'll go for them.
We're gonna switch cameras here. One second, let me get your camera. There you are. There he is.
Hello. Yeah, so let's change the place here. Well, okay, so I want to talk about music. Big reason I want to talk about music is it's a huge section of this chapter. In mine, the chapter is about 34 pages and music is about 14 pages of it. So it's more than a third of this chapter is her talking about music. And she spends a fair bit of that doing some sort of throat clearing about how, well, we don't really have an objective theory of music, and this is just my theory. I can't really prove it. A lot of things need to be done, etc. I think actually it's funny because I actually wish she would have done more of that sort of throat clearing and all those more of those caveats on some of the other things she said, because I think that what she ends up saying about music is mostly correct. This idea of the music being based on mathematical relationships. And in fact, I think if she does one thing, she understates the evidence for it. She understates how much of a basis there is for it. And she refers to Helmholtz, a 19th century scientist who wrote about, air vibrations, or the mathematics of the vibrations in the air. But actually, a lot of what we know about the mathematical basis of music goes back much, much, much farther. It goes back to Pythagoras, who was the ancient Greek mathematician and philosopher. Now, circa 550 BC, so over 2,500 years ago. And Pythagoras actually had this sort of goofy theory about how everything was numbers. Everything is really, it's sort of Plato came along later and said everything is abstract forms, everything is abstractions, and reality is an illusion. Well, he kind of was the precursor to that. Everything is numbers, and and if we got to the real reality of things, we'd see it's all just numbers. But you can see why he got excited about that, because one of the things he started out doing was by looking at the mathematics of music, and he realized that music is numbers. I think Joia said is proportions, and that's what he discovered, that music was ratios. Now, before I get into that, I just want to say one caveat on that, which is that it's not all mathematics. So Ayn Rand says at one point, music doesn't try to imitate reality. Well, sometimes it does. So one piece I'm going to recommend to you is called The Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams, English composer, very early 20th century. He did a piece of the violin piece with orchestral accompaniment, and the main violin solo starts something like this. It goes. Sorry. You can see if it's called The Lark Ascending, that sort of the trills there, that sort of warbling sound is supposed to be kind of imitating the song of a bird. So there is an imitative aspect there. And so the lark ascending is really the violin as this lark flitting around over the meadow, and the orchestra is sort of the countryside in which it's flitting. Actually, I highly recommend the piece. You can look it up on YouTube. And it's been described, The Lark Ascending has been described as the foremost work of English landscape painting as a piece of music. But the base of all that imitation, though, there has to be, the base of music is mathematical, because the tones that we use, the scales that we use, the chords that are used are all based on mathematical relationships that were initially identified over 2,500 years ago by Pythagoras. So he was the idea that came up with this idea that musical notes are different musical pitches represent different mathematical relationships, numerical relationships. And I illustrate this briefly on a violin. I promise you I will not play this violin for you because I am very much a beginner, and I'm not confident enough to actually play a piece of music, much less The Lark Ascending, which is very difficult. But I'm just going to play a note on here. Now that's the A string. Now I'm playing it on what's called an open string, so I'm not doing anything with the string. But how do you make different notes on a string? Well, you hold it down with your finger. So let's see a little scale. Now you can see why I'm not playing much more for you. But when you hold down your finger, what you're doing is you're shortening the string. So when you hold it down, you're pinning it down there. So what's vibrating now is not the whole string. It's not everything from here to here. It's just this portion. So you get a slightly higher note. And the shorter the amount of string that's vibrating, the higher the note you get. So if you, let's see if I can guesstimate this, if you go exactly halfway you'll get a note like this. And what you'll notice the relationship, if I can get this right, is what you'll get is what you normally refer to as an octave, but it's generally experienced by the listener as, we do the octaves on the piano here, so we don't have to worry about getting the pitches right. So that's what I was just playing. That's an octave. What you experience it as is you experience it as, well, that's the same note, just higher, right? So, and if we do it an octave down to here, it'd be the same note, but lower. But what Pythagoras discovered is how you get this relationship of the octave is that this is a string that is half the length of this string, which is half the length of this string. So that relationship of an octave is a mathematical ratio. It's a 2-to-1 ratio. Half the length of the string, you get the higher note. And so what you're experiencing in musical form is you are experiencing, when you do an octave, you are experiencing a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you wanted a 1-to-1 ratio, that's just the same note over again. A 2-to-1 ratio is this. And its experience is, it's such a close connection between the two. It's experienced as being the same note, just higher. And so that is, now that brings us to the issue of consonants. So we experience these notes as consonant, as meaning going together, two sounds that go together. And the most consonant interval is that octave. And so when you get to Helmholtz, you know, for Pythagoras, it's, well, this is a string that's exactly half the length of the other string. By the time Helmholtz's time, they understood what's going on here is you're getting twice as many vibrations per second on the shorter string. The shorter the string, the faster it vibrates. And so you're getting twice as many, exactly twice as many vibrations per second. So if you represent that as sound waves, it's like, you know, like a sine wave of the vibrations going back and forth. Every time you have 2 vibrations for the higher note, you'd have exactly 1 vibration for the lower note. And your ear, so our ears, you know, over millions of years of evolution, our ears have developed into highly sensitive mechanisms for detecting and for analyzing sound. And so our ears are trying to analyze the sounds, they're analyzing the wavelengths. And when they analyze the wavelengths, they say, we have a match with this. Exactly 2 vibrations on this one for 1 vibration on the other. These line up, they really match. And it's experienced by us as consonants, as these notes go together. In fact, they go together so much they're the same note, just higher. Right, so that's a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, what Pythagoras did, he carried this on and said, well, what about a 3-to-2 ratio, the next simplest ratio? Well, a 3-to-2 ratio turns out to be this. And this is, I'm doing this on the C scale, so it's C and G. It's called a fifth because if you go in the notes of the keyboard, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's called the fifth. And that's sometimes called the dominant. So this is the tonic, the bass tone, and this is the dominant. And it's the next most consonant interval because of the mathematics. It's 3 vibrations for every, on this one is 3 vibrations for every 2 vibrations here. So it's a 3-to-2 ratio. And that's the underlying mathematics of it. And this is something you recommend because if you've been to an American church and they've sung a hymn, you've probably heard something along the lines of Amen. So that sort of amen is always the dominant to the tonic. It's this note to this note, going from the most consonant to the bass. And that's that experience of sort of coming to an end, to a conclusion of saying, amen, we are done with the hymn. Right, so that's taking advantage of that simple mathematical ratio of 3-to-2. We'll go to the next one. Next simplest ratio is 4-to-3. And 4-to-3 turns out to be this. And that's what's called the third because 1, 2, 3 is the third note up on the scale. And that's the next most consonant one. So if we take the bass note, the most consonant thing, the octave, the dominant, the next most consonant, the next most consonant, what do we get? We get a major chord, right? So this is the basic major chord, and this is how the basic major chord got to be the basic major chord, is it is the most consonant notes based on the bass note. And the important thing here is that your ear, like I said, the ear and the auditory centers of the brain are developed over millions of years of evolution to be able to as machines for analyzing frequencies of notes. So your ear automatically integrates all this. It automatically tries to make these relationships. So when you play a chord like this, and you have all these notes going through the chord, your ear will know what the bass note is. It'll know that these are the notes that go with this. And that's one of the basic relationships that every composer takes advantage of. So I'm going to do a very, very short piece here that takes advantage of this knowledge. I'm going to play it first. I'm going to give a quick analysis, and I'll play it later. It's a very short, it's just one page here. It's Chopin's Prelude in E minor, Opus 28, number 4. And hopefully I won't make too many mistakes. I can't hear you clapping, but Sherri says you're clapping. I'm clapping too because I'm very relieved to get through that without doing pretty well. I never get nervous talking to people because I do that for a living, you know, but I don't perform for people musically very often. So big sigh of relief.
Wonderful,
right, so,
wonderful.
The interesting thing about this, though, is that first, the analysis I'm about to give, by the way, you'll be credits here. I got this partly from a guy named Benjamin Zander. He's a British music conductor and gave a great talk on the power of classical music at the TED talk he gave years ago. You can find it online. He does this piece and analyzes it. So I took part of my analysis from him. I took part of it from Sherri, who did it once for she played it for, so she's been taking piano lessons with alongside our kids. So she played it to a bunch of 8, 9, 10-year-old kids at a piano recital and gave a little talk about it. But so the most important thing about this is this is a Chopin prelude, and Chopin wrote exactly 24 preludes, as Opus 28 was 24 preludes, and he wrote one for every key. So he did, this is prelude in E minor, there's one in E major, there's one in F, there's one in F sharp, etc. So for every key, every major and minor key, he wrote a prelude. So the fact that this is an E minor is really important, because I said that when you hear these chords, you know what the base of the chord is. So it's really important. This is an E minor chord, is the fundamental behind this piece, the backbone of this piece. And you can tell that right at the beginning because he does this. And that there is E, G, B, and E. That's an E minor chord. Now, before I gave you the major chord, this is the E major chord, right? So this is the most consonant things. When you get a minor chord, you just take this third and you make it a minor third, meaning you take it down a half step and you go to this. And you get something that's a little bit dissonant. This is not, when the wave lengths aren't adding up neatly. lining up neatly. You have a little bit of dissonance. But the important thing is it's just a little bit of dissonance. So it doesn't clash horribly like, I don't know, maybe this would, or, there you go. There's a nice clashing dissonance. One of these, I remember hearing it, it's like a 47 to 36 ratio. It just doesn't line up at all. It's really highly dissonant. This one, the minor chord that we're doing, it's just a little bit dissonant. And so it introduces just a little bit of something not quite lining up. And Ayn Rand talks about how, I think where she's online is that these relationships, these mathematical relationships and the ability to resolve them ties into our emotional experiences. So a little bit of dissonance ties into a little bit of something wrong, a little bit of something you can't quite resolve. So a minor chord is sometimes experienced as mysterious, meaning we're missing some information. It's discordant because there's something that doesn't line up because we're missing information. There's a mystery there. Or it's discordant because we're sad. I think that's the sort of standard thing. A minor chord is sad. All right, so the important thing is this is an E minor. And so if we did an E minor scale, it looks something like this. This would be the first 5 notes of E minor chord. And here's the thing. The main melodic line in this piece is these notes. So notice we do. So we've had this sort of sighing. It's self-described as sighing. Sigh. But the sigh is going down and it's taking us down through this progression of notes. And I told you, our ear knows what the bass note is. So if you're going in this progression, I know you're muted and you can't hear me, but I want you to all to hum with me and do this progression. Go, da, 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 da. What's the next note? If you're humming at home, you probably went to this. So when you start hearing this progression of notes, your ear knows that it's going down and this is home base. This is where it wants to go. This is where it's going to go to come to rest, because that is the main dominant note. And we had that established immediately in the first measure. See, we're given the E minor chord. We know then that we're going. Now, I also want one other thing I'll throw in here, which is that if we were to go, if that were our main melody, it would be rising. And might have the experience of I'm sad, but I'm rising up out of it. But this is you're falling. It's. And like I said, he adds that we're sort of sighing down into it. So it's this very sad falling down in search of the bass note. And so people have described it as, the minor chord gives you a sense of distress or of sadness. And we come for this distress and sadness, we're sort of falling down into it until we reach home base. And generally speaking, this piece is interpreted as being about grief and about the process of grieving, that you are trying to work through this sadness and then finally reach some sort of resolution, or in today's parlance, that would probably be called a closure, right? So you're grieving, you're trying to come to closure. So that's what you're doing in this first half. But then you'll notice you're almost there. You're already down to F sharp, the last note before you get to E. And then you do this. And you're back to B, you're over at the beginning. So you have this like little rebellion. You're falling down. You're almost at this point of reaching the home base, but you have a little rebellion. You fight against it and you go back up and start at the beginning. And that makes sense because, if you're grieving something, you don't want to get through the grief process too quickly. You resist it because, how little could this person have meant to you? Let's say someone you know and love has died. How little could this person have meant to you if you could just, I'm done, let's go on. You fight against the resolution, if you fight against the closure, and that's what the rest of this, so we have also this much more. So notice we're going, you have a small rebellion, then you have a big rebellion. You're fighting against the closure, against coming home. And then finally the piece you go, and we finally reach the E. But there's something wrong when we finally reach the E. And this is, the genius to show, why don't we reach the E before this? Well, the piece would be over, but also, you'd reach your closure. You wouldn't have the full experience. But he finally gets you to the E, but he's not quite ready, done with you yet, because you get the note, here are the notes you get in the left hand. And the thing is, those are the wrong notes. If you take the E, the C, the E, and the G, that's a C major chord. That's not an E minor chord. So we're trying to get down to the base of an E minor chord, but we're not getting there. We have the wrong notes to go with it. Then he gives us a bunch of the other wrong notes. A whole bunch of wrong notes he gives us. And then we finally go to this. Oh, sorry. And then we pause a moment, take a breath, and then we go, he gives us 2 more wrong chords. And then he says, now I'm finally gonna let you have what you were wanting. That's a full out E minor chord. We're finally home, we're finally where we wanted to be, the whole piece, but we do it here. The very last chord, the very last note of the piece, he makes you wait to finally get to that closure. And so to recap, what we have is we have a series of falling, sighing notes going down this first 5 notes of the E minor scale. And we're trying to get down to this E, but first he says, well, no, we're gonna rebel against that and go back up and start again. And then we're gonna have a big violent rebellion where we resist doing it. Then we're finally getting down to the E, but it's the wrong chord, and it's the wrong chord, and it's the wrong chord, it's a whole bunch of wrong chords. And then finally, he's going to give us the right chord, and we're home, and we've gone through this process of grief and gotten to the point of rest, of closure in modern terms. All right, so I'll play it one more time so you can hear all of that. So I think now that you've been talked through, you can see everything that he's doing in this piece. And I think this is a great example. Jonathan's been persistently asking this question about the passivity. Do you just consume art passively? I think it's the most common view of art. Do you just consume art passively? The work of understanding a work of art and knowing what's going into it, how much does that add to it? I think this is, when I first saw Benjamin Zander do this, was a great revelation to me about how much more you can get out of a piece when you understand exactly what it's doing. And that adding more knowledge about how this piece works actually adds to the experience instead of detracting from it. But it also shows you how, this set of mathematical relationships that we used, the ratios that you use to build up a chord and to understand how a chord works and how this mathematical relationships to the notes helps you understand that Chopin is relying on that completely throughout. He's relying on those mathematical relationships your ear's ability to recognize them and analyze them. And this whole piece succeeds or fails depending on the fact that you know that when you go, your ear knows you're going. And if you didn't know that, if that weren't the case, this piece would not work at all. It's only because your ear is capable of identifying those mathematical relationships that's why you get the big payoff when you finally hit that low E minor chord at the end. And it's all because of the underlying mathematics of the piece. So I think I've taken probably more time than I said I would.
Fantastic. Excellent. Excellent job.
Okay.
So, so I'm going to open it up for questions again. Thank you, Rob. That was very special. Thanks. I want to say a couple of things. One about the scales. The Greeks knew a lot about scales. So they had an Ionian scale, which is a pentatonic scale. It's a very simple scale. It has the feeling of kind of brightness and serenity together. It's very simple. It's equivalent to the Indian rag called bhoop, which is it's also pentatonic. That is the same scale which Chinese music uses a lot. And all of them, go ahead.
I just want to mention one of the things about, I recommend the Lark Ascending. And one of the things about it is it uses that pentatonic scale because it's considered, it has this old fashioned sort of folk music quality to it. So he's relying on that.
Absolutely. And the Greeks knew all about this. So for example, they thought that these different scales corresponded to different characters. So the Ionic character is very kind of simple, focused on the good in the most direct way, and supporting that. Whereas the Phrygian scale, it has a lot of minor notes in that. So it was considered to be kind of, what shall I say, a little bit kind of barbaric, a little bit kind of lascivious kind of a thing. And that's kind of equivalent to the rag Bhairavi in the Indian scale. So, and what happens is that when you actually hear it, and it's all about the ratios, the simplicity, the simpler the ratios, like C, D, I cannot translate it. I have always the fifth note, sixth note, and those ratios are the simplest ratios. And so the affect it produces in our emotional system is that of, oh, I recognize this. This goes well together. Whereas when there is a very complex ratio, it is jarring. It is jarring. So for example, the sharp fourth note was considered the devil note because that is the hardest note to jive with the rest of the scale. So it's a huge question. All right, so Jairo, you had a question? Let's keep it short because I want to do breakout rooms, but you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, you know what, let's do one thing. Let's just go do breakout rooms, talk about all these issues, and then we can come back. Give me just a second. I'm recreating the breakout rooms. Joia, do you want to add anything?
Not yet. No, I'm excited to do the breakout rooms and then we can come back and discuss.
Okay, so 7 people. Give me just a second here. Hold on. Let's do one thing. Can Rob or Sherri or Joia, can you talk about, it's going to take me about a minute to set up the breakout rooms. Can you talk about what's the next chapter next week?
Well, also,
sure. The next chapter is all about literature. So I'm really excited because this is my favorite. So for me, literature and music are my favorites. And maybe while you're doing this, I'll mention, because I had brought up the question for people to think about some of their own personal idiosyncrasies when it comes to art. And so I'll just share, this is one that I've observed personally for myself, that I've realized that I'm not a very visual person. And so I absolutely love when we have Sherri on all of these calls, because she has this amazing ability to take the visual and transform it into something that is linguistic and verbal and narrative. So it's like literally translating that art form into language that I understand. For me, I respond most positively to the forms of art that go in a sequence, that have a beginning, middle, and an end. So a story or music. And one of the interesting things I realized about myself, even when I was in high school, was I realized as much as I loved music, I was always drawn to musical theater or opera, or even something like Cirque du Soleil, where there was music in service of a story. And even that realization was what made me decide to then go pursue English and literature as the major, and then even eventually in grad school is definitely my favorite of the art forms.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. They will last for 20 minutes and we can come back and we can talk about our takeaways then. Starting the breakout rooms now. So Rob and Sherri, are you there?
Here we are.
All right. Okay, so folks, it's time for takeaways. So I'm going to just call people in the order in which I see them. And after the takeaways, we'll keep track of all the questions, all the comments, all the questions, and then we will look at the themes that come from it. During the takeaways, you can also put on the table whatever question that you have, one question. If you want to skip takeaways, you can just type skip. Okay, so I'm going to start with, let's see, Catherine, Jonathan, and Louis. Catherine, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, Catherine, you still need to unmute. Okay, I'll go to Jonathan. You can go ahead and unmute yourself meanwhile. Jonathan, go ahead. Oh, just a second. Maybe there is a problem. Hold on. It's a problem on my side. Sorry, Catherine. Problem on my side. Catherine, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just comment as a visual artist that I think that the modern art movement has really watered down our experience of art for many people. If people learn more technique again, they would get more involved and be able to create more complex works. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Excellent point. Jonathan.
Thanks, Shrikant. Yeah, a couple of takeaways from me, but I think that the main thing is just getting clearer on the idea that art has a lot of depth. There are many different forms, and that has, like I brought up as a question earlier, implications for the way we should approach it, how we engage in it, and that will also affect what we get out of it.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next up is Louis, Dave, and Lloyd. Louis.
Hi, thank you very much. Interesting discussion by everyone. The breakout was fantastic. Felt really short. My comment relates to this distinction between music as art and everything else as art. It seems like she has categorized these two things as different, and I don't quite understand it. The takeaway is the fact that music at its simplest element seems to be at least a call and response that works as well with whether you're playing the blues or you're throwing red paint on a canvas. It demands a response from you, and to the extent that you interact with that let's say call of the artist, they are similar in that aesthetic. So I definitely need to read more on this distinction by her.
Interesting. Thank you, Louis. Next up is going to be Dave, Lloyd, and Ash. Dave?
Thanks, Shrikant. Sherri and Rob, very good presentation. I'm a liberal coming along trying to discover Ayn Rand, but a comment I would make I went through this phase about 50 years ago when I first saw Picasso's Cubism. My response was, well, that's not art. And then when I saw Jackson Pollock, that's not art. But I've come to realize that Picasso probably was looking beneath the surface. And, of course, we have a skeleton, but he probably saw squares and triangles or whatever and said, well, what the heck, I'm going to try that. And it's, so he drew a face with squares, triangles, cubes, whatever. And by gosh, you see the face. And to me, it's like something I saw online. It was a paragraph where they take out all the vowels. Well, they take out all the vowels, you can't read it. Oh, but your brain adapts. You read it easily. And the other one I would mention is it's either Manet or Monet. I always forget, the people in the park, it's all dots of color. But we take a step back and you see the picture. And to me, it's equivalent to in the 1950s when black and white TVs first came out, they said, well, we want you to buy this black and white TV. And oh, by the way, there's dangerous radiation. You've got to sit 7 feet away or else you're gonna die. And that was just to keep the kids from sitting right up against the screen and see there were just a bunch of dots. It wasn't a picture. So in our TV screens now, we have red, green, and blue dots. We don't have any white dots. There are no yellow dots. It's all made from these three, and there's millions of these dots, but we create a picture. But anyway, thanks again. These are very educational. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Andrew, Ash, and Peggy. Andrew?
Sure. This has been really nice. It reminded me of some studying I'm doing right now regarding drawing, specifically in the form of sketching, as a means of clarifying one's ideas and concepts to oneself, as opposed to, let's say, developing as an expression for other people, i.e., painting or music or so forth. And so a lot of this, to me, it'd be interesting to explore the cognitive side of the role of art, and that it's not necessarily an expression of some metaphysical kind of concept, but it's actually a means of learning, a way of clarifying your own thoughts and actually building knowledge. And there are some specific examples of that maybe I could talk about another time. It's really quite interesting.
Fantastic observation. Thank you, Andrew. Next up is Ash. Let me see who else. Ash, Peggy, and Rupali. Ash.
Yeah, I guess my main takeaway would be what Joia talked about earlier when she read the passage from the chapter where Ayn Rand talks about how integration and range are kind of the fundamental aesthetic criteria for judging. In that passage, she's discussing music, but Joia was applying that more broadly to art in general, and I agree with that. And every time I read this book, it jumps out at me more and more, like all the different ways in which integration is really kind of key and fundamental to understanding what's going on in art. So like there's another passage at the beginning where Ayn Rand talks about how all of the different forms of art depend on the different sensory modalities that they're expressed in. But she talks about them all as in some way integrating your perception to your concepts, your percepts to your concepts, and thereby unifying your mind. So I find that really interesting. And I guess my big question then would be, just to work out some more of the ways that this integration happens, both, within different levels of abstraction and across different levels of abstraction, kind of explore that more in depth.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ash. Great observations. Next up is going to be Lloyd, Peggy, and Rupali. Lloyd.
Thank you. Great discussion. Just wanted to pick up on one of the things that Rob was saying, which was that the more you know about the artist and the art of painting, the more you get out of it. And I think I trace that back to where you don't get art history education in high school or middle school. And so you really don't have a knowledge foundation there. So I just think I would encourage all people to encourage other people that when you do go to an art museum, you take a tour, with somebody who knows art. If you're interested in John Singer Sargent, they could give you a tour of the American Wing at the Met. And so at least you'll get some background, because you are very passive, just walking around with no knowledge of art history, you know, background, and looking at paintings, and you're really not going to get a lot out of that. You need a tour guide, you need some info to kind of understand what's going on.
Thank you. Next up is Peggy, Rupali, and Joe. Peggy?
Yes, I really enjoyed the art group and hearing about how people express themselves in an art way or creative way. So that was fascinating. And also, we unanimously wanted to ask you if you would do a lecture on Indian scales music in comparison to Western. We thought that would be really fascinating.
I'll keep that in mind. I'll keep that in mind.
Okay,
That's going to be quite an undertaking, but yeah, I've thought about it. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Next up is Rupali, Joe, and Jeff. Rupali?
Hi, thank you again for another wonderful conversation. As I was saying in our breakout room, these conversations help me clarify what I do personally and why I do it. So this going back to this book again after many years has been extremely helpful for me. And one of the things, like the takeaway, is that all of these art forms are sensory experiences, and they are also the sensory experiences cause an emotional experience based on our values. And it's just fascinating to see, how from when I read this book many years ago, and when I first came across Ayn Rand as a teenager to now, much later, yes, the sense of life is the same, but as I develop deeper understanding, it kind of just evolves and has been things that have meant very important earlier have now kind of morphed into something else. So I feel that as people go through their development too, their appreciation for art also changes. So thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. Next up is Joe, Les, and Jeff. Joe?
I mean, there's a couple takeaways, but one in particular is that I've actually thought recently about getting back into music, and the way Rob explained it to me just now really just it changed my whole perception and understanding it through ratios. It makes it easier to learn. If it had been explained that way to me, I would have been so much better off. I would have understood the constraints, and then I would have understood how to make beautiful music within those constraints. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying I wouldn't have been anything special, but the idea I would have understood, the concepts of what I was actually playing. And then the ratios, it all made sense. So, I mean, this was really enlightening and one of those ones that I would just go back and watch again. So thank you, Rob, for your demonstration, because that will change my whole perception on how to learn about music. And the analytical aspect of it became much more clear today as well. So it was kind of mind-blowingly good. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Les, Jeff, and Heather.
Yeah, hi. I'd just like to build on what Joseph said. I really appreciated that performance by Rob, and just gave me a new appreciation of this, the performing arts. And there's one particular paragraph in the book that I thought was very important, that she stresses the role. She says here, the psycho-epistemological role of the performing arts, the relationship to man's cognitive faculty, lies in the full concretization, there's Sherri's term, of the metaphysical abstractions projected by the work of the primary arts. The distinction of the performing arts lies in their immediacy in the fact that they translate a work of art into into a concrete event open to direct awareness. This is also their danger. Integration is the hallmark of art. Unless the performance and the primary work are fully integrated, the result is the opposite of the cognitive function of art. It gives the audience an experience of psycho-epistemological disintegration as opposed to integration. So I think that just reminds me of when actually I was playing the keyboard a little bit. And I think for an unforeseen event, I decided to put the keyboard down, but I played the Tennessee Waltz myself, and I just loved that song, and I learned to play pretty good, and then I just kind of put it away. But just listening to Rob here and explaining the process, and the fact that it's a system, I really like that. You can understand the system and the breakdown analysis. I thought he did a great job of it. I really like it. Plus, the other thing I really liked about here, she talks what is art and what's not art, and how she defined it, the differentiating the genius. And I think, unfortunately, she excludes us as a work of art, which I think that's fine. It's man-made objects she's referring to, not ourselves as a subject. So, and that's near the end of the chapter. So I found that this whole chapter is almost like a book in itself. There's so many ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Les. Great observations. Thanks. Next up is Jeff, Heather, and Mike. Jeff?
Hi, I want to offer something very personal. In my family, there are major mathematicians, as in people active in physics who worked on everything from the Manhattan Project to a great uncle who actually won a Nobel Prize. And my parent, I remember going with my son to his last class in computer science, where the entry requirement to get into that math class was every single calculus course offered at the University of Maryland. You couldn't get in until you had passed every one of those. He now leads teams of software developers in the Bay Area. And my parents moved to DC to be part of the Kennedy administration, and we went to see every performance later, at the Kennedy Center, and took everybody through the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I realized, after listening to Laura answer my question about the relationship between mathematics and art, that I really know very little about either one of those things. And one of the great things about this group that you created, Shrikant, is how often I come to that conclusion about how little I know regarding the subject that we are addressing on a wide range of questions, and what a wonderful thing that is for me personally. So I want to thank you for that, and it was reinforced today in many ways.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. Next up is Heather, Mike, and Laura. Heather?
I just wanted to comment, there's in my recent reading of this, Ayn Rand does have a very strict definition of art, but I found that in some sense you want to kick at the traces and find a lot of limitations in that. But I've actually had a much bigger problem in the past where people try to define it and they get to this sort of vague art's just a form of self-expression, or it's anything creative, or it's anything that anyone says it is. And that's a much more, ironically, maybe limiting way to approach it. So I've actually found Ayn Rand's attempt to put a very strict definition on it to be quite useful, just and it doesn't necessarily mean that anything that's not pure art is somehow degraded or unworthy, but it's just, for me, been a much more productive way to approach such an important and complex field than trying to leave the definition wide open.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Next up is Mike, Laura, and Marco.
The line of concrete jewelry reminds me of Dagny Taggart's line of Reardon Steel jewelry. And Rob, you're next. Your analysis of music reminds me of Gödel, Escher, and Bach's analysis of art and his eternal golden braid concept.
Wonderful.
One more thing. How do you differentiate between jewelry between polymers, porcelain, ceramic, and concrete?
Well, thank you.
Oh, that's a graduate level question there.
Yeah.
All right, we'll come to that. We'll take all the questions, all the graduate level questions afterwards. Thanks, Mike. Next up is going to be Laura, Marco, and Kevin. Laura, go ahead. Laura, you need to unmute. Okay, next up is Marco, Kevin, and Joel. Marco? Okay, next up is Kevin.
Thank you, the panelists. Good sharing. Last topic we talked about fear. About I immediately, think about one session share a picture. One lady had 2 kids. That's brave. When we have that picture, maybe we have answer about the fear. And today is I'll share another. Music, about musical art. So that's powerful. Obviously, when I learned a couple years ago, I learned the guitar. I don't have this concept. I lost contact I learned like logical 1, 2, 3, mathematically. But I think that this perspective, Rob give me some answer. Unfortunately, didn't have that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Laura, Aver, and Joel. Laura.
I want to thank John, Rob, for explaining the keyboard relationship. It was the first time I really learned that, even though I studied piano a number of years ago. But it really helped me to cue in on my view. I think I explained in my Q&A. Oh God, I can't talk anymore. In our breakout room, for me, as a painter, there often was like a really significant thing that I painted, and it just was so meaningful. And I built everything around it up to a point. And most of the time, there came a point where that significant, beautiful, wonderful thing had to go. And it was very painful to make that decision to take it away, do something. And so it was like a make or break decision. And of course, I knew that if I took it away, I'd never be able to replicate it. So it would be the end of it. And if I made a decision, I'd have to, I wouldn't kill the painting because I could always be in control, but that was always something that was part of the process. And when he was talking about the music and the funeral thing, and that it had to go back, I thought that was that moment when the person, reached that moment and said, okay, I got to go back, or that's my moment where I have to. And he went back and then, went ahead and did it. So I saw that was the same kind of moment I was thinking about in painting that he felt in his, in his music, in writing that piece. So that was really interesting. And also learning about the measures, I finally realized when on the tube of paint, there was always this percentage, and now I know what that was about. Because not every company put it on there, but now I know why Winsor Newton did that.
Wonderful.
So,
Thank you, Laura. Thanks. Next up is Aver, Joel, and Amelia. Aver, would you like to share anything? Okay. Next up is Joel, Amelia, and Judith. Joel, Darwin? Nope. Okay. Amelia, Judith, and Jenny. Amelia. Okay, Judith, Jenny, and somebody else, Hyro. So Judith, go ahead.
Yeah, so I very much enjoyed Rob's demonstration too, and like getting a little bit of a lesson in the breakdown of how an artist can create those effects, like the technical aspects of it. And every form of art has that. My daughter studied, dramatic writing, and then she went from, practicing on her own and mimicking other things that she read to getting taught, the structure, the form, how do you create these things? So I definitely understand all that value, but I'm also left with other thoughts, like Steinbeck, I think, said that if you want to be a writer, don't take lessons in learning how to write, just read a lot. And so many great writers do that. They're like almost hermits. They just have collections of books and they absorb it, and they're absorbing their lessons, but not necessarily the technical details. And I feel that, a couple of days ago in a breakout group, a young woman was saying how intimidated she felt to do her poetry and her art because everywhere she saw on the internet things that were better. And somebody mentioned that again in my breakout group today. So, because I guess we are just, we have access to so much more through the internet of art. And I understand it's not the same as when you see the physical piece in an art museum or wherever, but still we have all these things coming at us. So they're good, but they have a downside. And I think that the downside maybe is that the part of art that isn't exceptional or great, the part where you just do it yourself and learn, and you will never be the great artist, and you will never meet Ayn Rand's, qualifications of this is worthy. It still reflects a sense of life, and it still should be nurtured, and we should still, there's so much value in just doing it for yourself, whether it's music, dance, or visual. I just think it's so important, and we shouldn't hold ourselves to standards, and it should be encouraged that we don't have to. We can do it for pleasure, and there's a lot to take out of that just for that purpose.
It's a great observation. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. The last is Hyro. Hyro, what are your takeaways?
Yes, I like the Rob's presentation, and I have a question on Chopin's preludes and opuses. And you mentioned that he had to come up with 24 compositions, one for minor and majors. So why was that such a big deal for pianists then, considering that the piano was well tempered? Couldn't you just transpose one composition and then you're done? Why do you have to make one for each minor and major key? And another question is the idea of music theory. Is there something in color theory where you have a color at a certain frequency and you double it and you put them side by side, and they're kind of agreeable to us, and versus one that's off, that is not so agreeable when you put it, like for painting? Thank you.
Thank you, Hyro. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to summarize things, and there are some kind of very interesting themes that people have put on the table. So I want to offer that as a possible discussion, starting discussion point. Catherine reminded us how kind of modern art has dumbed down our sensitivity to what art can be. Jonathan has had excellent questions. He's talking about the depth of what art can do for us, and how do we actually make that happen? What is involved in making that happen? Lewis talked about this interesting concept of call and response that we can pursue of art. I think that is a very big issue in kind of performance art, innovation, improvisation. Andrew and Judith were making actually a very similar point that the artist does art to first concretize their own view. So if you are actually producing art, you're primarily doing it for yourself. And even if it does not meet the standards of somebody else, you would have succeeded in concretizing your sense of life. And that is a big achievement. You need that. And that's a much more powerful thing to do than to actually consume arts that somebody else has produced for that purpose, even if their art is objectively better. So I want to build on that point. I'm going to give Andrew a chance to talk more about it and Judith more a chance to talk about it. So that's one point I definitely want to look at it, because I'm a very big fan of not just being in spectator sports. I think participatory sports is where you need to be, and that's absolutely true for art. So that's one theme I want to take up. Ash talked about the fact that art is all about integration, and what are the various ways of doing this integration? That's another big question. Lloyd talked about the value of art education, educating oneself. Peggy wants me to do something on Indian scales and Western scales. Rupali talked about very interesting, that she had read this book maybe 20 years earlier, and now she's reading it again. This is again an experience that I found again and again, that all great works, they show you how much you've grown when you come back to them, because there are things that you will see. You will also know what is it that you already mastered, what is it that remains to be mastered. So that's always a fascinating experience. That's the same thing for me right now, and I'm suspect for all the panelists and anybody who is reading it. There were many people who commented on Rob's presentation on music, so I definitely want to do a follow-up. Let's build on that one on music. So art for your own sake, your own creation of art is one. Second is the music. Then Les talked about the performance art and how it is different. Joe talked about, again, Joe, Jeff, Laura all talked about the value of understanding the ratios in music. So we'll come back to that. So these are the big themes that I see, the kind of the value of you doing art. What is the value of you doing art? And then on music, and the point about, are we actually pursuing art in a way which does justice to the depth of what art does for us? So let's talk first about the individual art. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to give a chance for Andrew and Judith to expand on their points if they want. So Andrew, go ahead, and then we'll discuss this together. I'll give a chance for panelists to comment on this point, and then I'll invite anybody else who wants to talk about. The topic that we're talking about is the value of doing art yourself. What does that do for you? Forget about consuming of other people, art produced by other people. What is the value of producing art yourself? Andrew.
Okay, so thank you. The idea is, how I'm going to focus on drawing, and one of the subcategories of drawing is sketching. So I'm going to talk about how sketching kind of helps. Let's call that a form of art, right? And the idea is, how does that fit into the cognitive mechanics of learning? And the idea is this: essentially, you've got your short-term memory, which is where you're kind of doing your thinking, so to speak, and you've got your long-term memory where you kind of file things away and also retrieve information from. So maybe it was the discussion on the cave paintings that made me think about this, because it was talk about, it was theorized that this, by making these cave paintings, it helped them actually understand how the animals ran more, or their kind of physiology, or something to that effect. It was kind of a learning process. The idea is essentially you have some ideas. You can only kind of juggle a few things at a time, and you sketch as a kind of a way of like a temporary extension of your short-term memory. And by way of, and I've experienced this because I do kind of illustrations, by way of sketching, you actually then see like inconsistencies in your thought or things that are missing that you cannot possibly, kind of see or visualize, on your own. So you actually wind up learning. It's really quite fascinating. So, there's just a cognitive science to this part, not just kind of a metaphysical expression. And it's really quite fascinating. So I just wonder, some of the art, what appears to be more the, expressionist and metaphysical, is actually an expression of someone learning and trying to kind of put a concept down on paper.
All right, Joia has typed in 7 exclamation marks. So Joia, go ahead.
This is definitely a subject I feel very passionate about, that, and it's one that I think we haven't emphasized enough, even in the series we've been doing, and in this meetup in particular, the importance
Let's do it now. Go ahead.
Yes, let's do it, because I totally agree that a huge part of the value of art is to be an artist yourself. And this is something that came up in our small group discussion. And we had talked a little bit even about how, I think other people were saying how perhaps because of the internet, we're exposed to more art than ever before in the history of humanity. And in one sense, that brings up a lot of fear, to maybe connect it with an earlier discussion, because you perhaps see a pinnacle that you can't reach, which wouldn't have been the case centuries earlier. But that throughout art history, it's a relatively recent phenomenon to turn art into a spectator sport. That for most of human history, the art was something that people did, and it served its main need primarily as something that you did. And I found personally that even the best way to be a spectator is to be a spectator who's focused on craft, because you can learn something about the craft that then you can take and bring back to your own art. So I love, for example, even in Rob's demonstration, how he was showing how he learned all of these aspects about what it was that Chopin was thinking about when he was creating it, and that allowed Rob to take that and turn that into a really beautiful musical performance. So I just really want to stress, and I'm curious to even hear from everyone how they take these ideas that they learn from experiencing art to becoming an artist yourself. And I would just stress that it's not enough, we think perhaps about being a consumer versus being an artist. But as far as I'm concerned, the only reason to consume is to be able to then produce art of your own. And that art can serve this great function, even if you can't realize yet the level of craft of the great masters that you see all over the internet, that there's something so valuable to being a creator and to expressing your sense of life, and that hopefully it just spurs you to improve your craft so that you can better express the sense of life that you want to portray through your work.
Excellent. So I want to respond to Andrew. Andrew, I think sketching is very much similar to writing in that respect, because what it does is that, for example, when you write your thoughts down on a piece of paper, you can look at it and you can reflect on it and say, okay, did I capture everything that I needed to capture? Did I say it in the right order? Is it precise enough? How does it connect to these other things? And the same function is done when you draw something down. You can look at it, and there is another level of self-awareness. This is something that you have produced. Now you're saying, how does this now compare with my vision of what it is? And there is this iterative process of getting everything out there externally, so you can look at it. And it's a crucial part of learning. So Andrew, does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I agree. There's definitely a a similarity there. It's really quite fascinating how you can wind up learning just by way of expressing ideas.
No, this is a huge point. I mean, Jordan Peterson makes this point about speech itself.
Yeah.
That if you want to actually understand something, you must speak it out. You must write it out, because in that process of putting it out into the world, you're getting feedback from yourself, from other people, and you're using that to perfect it. So it's a natural way of doing it. Next up is going to be Joe, Marco, Sherri and Rob. If you have any point, you can go ahead and jump in. Do you want to say something?
Let me add just a little bit onto this about the idea of
speak a little bit closer into the mic.
Yeah, sorry. About how early scientists were using the process of drawing to make their understanding of the world. I mean, if we think about the way Galileo was drawing the planets and how they're located one another, and how it changed throughout time of year and things like that. If he didn't have pencil and paper to draw those individual details, what's that? Cat's interrupting, sorry. If he didn't have that level, the drawing process is part of the thinking process to make the observation. Oh, it's not quite like this. It's a little more like that. And that kind of thinking process is making it finer and finer gradations of your understanding of things. And when you're drawing like that, I think actually Rob and I talked about this many times, we love the idea of drawing being completely integrated with the science education, especially like biology, when you're learning about different creatures or leaves or different leaves. The process of drawing them causes your brain to focus on the differentiations between them to make understanding, to make a separate category for leaves of this shape and leaves of that shape. It makes ever finer levels of detail. That's what allows you to look at a leaf and see, oh, it should be a totally different classification because of the way the leaves are attached to the stems. If you didn't draw it, would you notice that some are alternate and some are completely in pairs? Would you notice that unless you drew it?
Excellent.
Probably not.
Excellent. Leonardo used to talk about, learning how to see.
Yes.
Drawing as a way of doing that. Also, I wanted to make a point about to those who kind of compare themselves to, the masters. You have to realize that everything that these masters have produced is through enormous amount of iteration, not only on the single piece, but doing that action again and again and again and again, a million times. And if you're going to hold yourself back, saying that the first time I tried it was not as good as Leonardo, no, it's not a real comparison, because it's only by doing it again and again and again and again that you are going to make it better. And if it stops you, and it's a crucial way of actually grasping, understanding the world, and to throw it away in comparison with other people, it just makes no sense. Next up is Joe, Marco, Rupali, and Kevin. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty difficult to build on everything that's been said because it's so, it's so profound. And the idea is that drawing, to me, is a way of expressing like concepts. And I see this as a way you get to the essence of something. So you put something down on paper and you keep putting these concepts down, but then you start to see how they interact with one another. And you can see this very clearly with ontologies, like where you're really trying to get, what is it that I'm saying? What is it? What's the essence of what I'm talking about here? And I can only do that visually. I couldn't write that out. Now, I know, like Joia had mentioned, she's much more literary in the sense that She likes stories and how the stories are beginning, middle, end. And then, that's how she extracts things. But it's important that I try and do both. That's the key, is that I try and write it out, and that I try and draw it out. And then I can start to see how all of it can kind of be succinctly stated, and I can get better at both, and I can start to articulate an idea clearly. And that's a process of trial and error. So I think that in the more things that you try, and just talking about, again, what Rob had taught us here today, think about the mathematical concepts that you can then apply to a regular mathematics class. Just learning the idea of what a ratio actually is and what it does and what vibrations are. I mean, it starts to bring context. Another level would be to actually try and do that. And then you're actually feeling it, you're experiencing it. And then you come back and you can actually use it for mathematical concepts. And that can only be done through experience. It doesn't have to be done well, but it just has to be at least experienced. And I think that helps with how you eventually can come to certain conclusions, your own conclusions, and get to the essence of what you're trying to express.
Yeah, I think the crucial concept is that of feedback, that once you produce something, you can actually look at it. And that feedback loop that you establish with things that you're creating enables you to perfect it, to kind of get things. Go ahead.
And one other thing I just think it really does as well is it provides an appreciation. Once you actually go through the experience, you can appreciate what it is. And that is really critical to knowing where, okay, that's beautiful because I've actually tried it and I know how difficult that is. So there's this experience that then allows you to come to the idea of what is beautiful.
Excellent. And kind of connecting this to Jonathan's point about the depth of art, I personally do not think that you can get the depth of art until you try to actually produce art in whatever means you choose in order to capture that. Because there is no way of saying that, okay, I'm just going to passively consume art and I want the best. No. Art is, fundamentally, it's by trying to actually create art that matches the deepest thoughts that you have any hope of capturing the depth of what art can do for you. Next up is going to be Marco, Rupali, and Kevin. Marco.
Me too.
Yeah, this was from like a masterclass that I took on writing, creative writing, and basically like it said that it brings out your creative, like everyone has like their own inner core, and so each time you put pen to paper or whatever art form, like you're sort of like extracting that inner core further and further out, and it just brings you further. It gets you to know yourself a lot better. Yeah, that's
absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great point. It's a really powerful tool for self-discovery. Next up is going to be Rupali, Kevin, and Laura. Rupali, go ahead.
Yeah. So to me, what does producing art do for yourself? I think it really slows you down from the every day we are just reacting to whatever's going on in our lives, right? And when you're producing art, you're actually just slowing yourself, whether you're sketching, drawing. It helps you to think more clearly of what you are doing or seeing. So for example, if it's a visual art expression, whether it's painting or sculpture, then you're slowing down to look at all the details. If you are producing music, you're paying attention to, just the rhythm or harmony. And then you can connect the dots with other things that are going on in your life. And you can make sense of what's going on based on your observations of, as you slow down. Whereas in the day-to-day of just doing things, you're just running to get your things done. So I think there's a lot to kind of think about how drawing or painting can help you think through whatever you're going through, and also to express maybe the highest feelings that you have. Thank you.
A great point, Rupali. I think that's profoundly true, because what art does is that it actually connects you to your deepest values. So it's a way of kind of stepping back instead of looking at just the problem of the day or something that you are involved in. Art allows you to kind of step back and say, what is really important to me? So it is experienced as kind of slowing down, also as kind of stepping back, also as kind of reconnecting to the deepest part of you, of saying, this is what is really important. So it is profoundly kind of rejuvenating in that sense. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Laura. Kevin?
Yes, thank you. The art is so personal. I feel art is life itself. I would put it as, I'm not an artist. I like drawing sometimes. I'm not a singer. I like singing as my best talk. And I'm not an actor. I act all the time, for better or for good. I always try something different. Even though I cannot do the same thing every time the same, but I try different. Another point, the process of learning each is so important in our daily life. Before pandemic, I learned drawing. It's I from like basic bird view, a hands-on view. It's so different when you see ourselves, see the object self. That's how we look at this world, right? When you look at it horizontally or from the top view, how historical view, different perspective. This is so dynamic. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you, Kevin. Laura, what are your observations about creating art? If you could be brief, go ahead.
Well, for me, given my brain trauma that I had, the only thing that I could really feel like that I could begin my life with was art. That was from my childhood. My strongest feelings were for art, and have been since that time. And I've been emerging since that time. I will continue to always emerge, I guess. I think that's what artists always do. I wound up being an expressionist artist. I think I always liked that type of art, even as a kid. But I have to say, it's also because it's the only thing that I could have control over in my life. And that still stands, you know. I can't control anything else in my body or my brain for that matter, except for doing art. And so it's a very critical part of my life. And it's that who I've become. I call myself a painter though, because it's an action verb. Artist somehow is the pinnacle, and there's a long way to go to reach that. So that's what I have to say. And I just want to say one more thing to Dave. When you were talking about triangles and this and that, that is abstract art. It's abstract art is about
Let's not go into that. We're just talking currently about
just wanted to tell
the process.
that.
Yeah, the process of creating art and what it does for you. And thank you. I mean, it's a very powerful thing, because what happens is that I think because art connects to something deep in you, in spite of whatever else is going on, you are able to connect to that. So thank you very much. Next up is Jairo. Jairo, what are your thoughts about creating art and what it does for you?
Yes, thank you very much. I actually wondered about music, like what came first in music, the melody or the lyrics?
Jairo, we're not talking about, we're just talking about creation of art. What is the experience of creation? Let's go to the music next. Okay, so I'm going to, let's transition.
Isn't that art?
What's that?
Isn't that creating music art?
No, we are talking about, the topic right now is very simply, what does producing art do for you? Why should you produce art yourself? That is the question that we are discussing. But we are going to come to music next, okay? Thank
Can
you.
I say one more thing about producing art, just to
Go
connect
ahead.
this back to Ayn Rand and her theory?
Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to connect this back with this idea. I don't know if we talked about this enough in this lesson, about what her theory of art is all about. And in one word, I would say it's selection. She talks about art as a selective recreation of reality. And I think this just ties into the point of when you're producing art, that you start with that blank page or the blank canvas or the silence in the room if you're creating music. And it's what you select. And precisely because you're starting with blankness, and so everything that ends up being in that work of art is something that you choose. And that the fact that it is chosen is what makes art so powerful for you. And you might not even know consciously why you're choosing it. That's why art is a representation of your subconscious sense of life. But the very fact that it got selected and it got put onto that blank, what was the blank canvas or page or silence in the room, is part of what makes art so powerful and necessary. And that is, I think, a huge part of the function of what art is and what it does for us.
Yeah, that's excellent. I want to connect that to Carl Jung's theories, because what it does is that, like, moment you produce art based on these subconscious ideas that you have, now you can look at it. So you have suddenly kind of increased the consciousness of your subconscious values, and you've kind of concretized them, you've brought them into light, you're able to reflect on it more. So it's a process of kind of supercharging your subconscious and your conscious at the same time through this activity. Wonderful. Any kind of closing thoughts on this particular thing, Rob or Sherri, on kind of importance of creating art yourself before we go on to music?
Well, this is maybe a bridge between the two, because it's going to be talking about making music. But one of the reasons part of the reason I got back in, or both of us got back into performing music, was because when we had kids, we didn't want them to think music comes out of this, and we wanted them to know that you could create it. But the greatest pleasure for me from learning how to play piano again, right? I did it when I was a kid and then stopped for a long time and came back to it. About playing piano again is I now have my own interpretation of various favorite pieces of classical music, and will actually be without that Pandora radio, listening to performances of various pieces I've ever heard before. We'll look at each other and say, "Oh, that's completely wrong," and it'll be some famous pianist, somebody who's actually made it to Carnegie Hall. I've never made it to Carnegie Hall, but somebody who's actually top level performance. But I've gotten deeply enough into the piece to have an idea of here's what this piece is about, here's what it should be expressing at each point. And it gives you just a so much deeper, fuller appreciation of something when you performed it yourself, when you had to think through by the nature of performance, had to think through every little bit of it and what it's supposed to be doing. And one thing that we haven't returned to is something she says in here about art being a conditioner of your consciousness. That it definitely helps you express what you think, but it can change how you think about things. And I was thinking the other day about why I like Chopin so much, because many of us, this piece I just played is about mourning, process of mourning. Shakespeare is famous, Chopin is famously very sad, right? He has Funeral March, and he has some upbeat pieces. I can't play them because Chopin can only be happy after he had a triple espresso. So they're all super fast that I can't keep up with them. They're beyond my ability. But he needed a lot of stimulation apparently to be in good mood.
But they're always a bit of both in every one of his pieces.
And oftentimes he will have a piece that's all in a minor key, and the last chord is in a major key. So it's like this, finishing it by lifting the mood a little. But I was thinking about why I like Chopin so much, even though he's so sad. And I think it's because irrespective of the content of the piece, the emotional content of the piece, what Chopin is really showing you is what it's like to feel deeply and profoundly about something, and what it's like to process through your thoughts and your feelings on this extremely deep and complex level. So he's giving you a demonstration of what it's like to be inside the head of someone who is thinking very deeply and feeling very deeply and profoundly about things. And it doesn't matter what it is so much, it matters less what it is he's thinking about or feeling, then the fact that these people are doing it in such a, bringing up so many different layers and levels and having such a deep, rich consciousness. And that's what he's conveying to you. And I think that's what people love about it.
That's fantastic. So let's just close. I just want to continue on this point, because this is a very crucial point, that you appreciate music tremendously the moment you start performing it, because you actually see how things are put together. You also see kind of not just the notes, but you kind of see what the notes are supposed to do, and you learn to do it. So it's same thing with sketching. You will, moment you start sketching, you start appreciating visual arts a lot more, because you can see how it is put together. Second point that you're making is that art is very deep. It's not just about the subject. It is also about how does your consciousness operate? How do you feel deep emotions? How do you see things clearly? How do you reason through things? So it's like there could be, you read, let's say, Oscar Wilde, or you read Shakespeare, even if the topic doesn't interest you, just the way it is done. And if you're trying to write like that, you kind of learn those aspects. So it's like, this rich base at the psycho-epistemological level, in addition to the metaphysical level. And that psycho-epistemology is critical, because you can't really get that elsewhere unless you actually do it. So that's a huge point. Rob, I think we are a little bit over time, but the response that you got to your musical performance and demonstration was extremely powerful. It's like, just many people talked about it.
Something about that. I just want to mention that I've been thinking for a while, actually, and because I have so many things going on, I've had a hard time thinking of it. I've been thinking for a while of doing a podcast, a semi-regular podcast, where I would basically do what I just did there, just take a piece and go over it. And I like specifically the idea of doing it as an amateur pianist, and because I'm very much an advocate of the amateur musician, and I think that everybody's appreciation of music would be so much vastly improved if they were playing it themselves. So it's something I consider, given the response, I might consider doing more.
Judith, you had a point about the value of making art yourself. Go ahead.
Well, you all said all the things, all wonderful things. I think I would just want to emphasize or add that, like, while a blank page is very intimidating, and I can't myself do anything with a blank page very much, unless I have something to work off of, something somebody else has done. And I think that's okay. I think imitation is important. It's like learning those technical aspects that Rob showed us in music. It's a way of discovering, oh, like, how did this work? Oh, how does this go? And sometimes it's just hard. You can't make headway if you have no training and you pick up a page and you're just like, oh, let me just draw, So I don't think people should be intimidated by that. That's or feel that they're somehow it's not of value, because writers do it, artists do it, musicians do it. They imitate before they ever get anywhere. And then they become creative when they've mastered it. And sometimes they're just absorbing these lessons without some classroom direction. So there's a lot of ways that people learn. And then I'll just throw in one last thing, is just that other than, how you personally use art, I think we talked briefly, but art lets you access things emotionally that aside from a goal of producing something just to express your emotions, like with people with dementia, like in nursing homes and everything, that's the only way that they can then express their feelings is through art, like drawing, usually, painting, and music, dancing or singing, or just the appreciation of music. So it goes deep, it's like the last thing we hold on to sometimes, if that's the trajectory of our lives and we end up that way, so it's really, really important, I think.
No, that's a very important point. Laura was also making the same point that this is very deep. It goes very deep, and it's like the last thing, because it is kind of subverbal. It actually brings together so many, because it is the point that Ash was making about integration, because it is integrated with so many different things. And our brain is an integrated mechanism that is, you probably can have it for a long period of time, and it will still speak to you for a very long time. So, okay, Sherri and Rob, yes.
Yeah. Speaking of this, one thing I was hoping, thank you for bringing that up. I was really hoping to be able to bring in here, was many of these we've been talking about cognitively how art works for young children and how that develops as we age. But there's one thing that I wanted to throw out here, which is the power of music at an incredibly early infancy. This is something, if any of you have do this little experiment with, well, except for we're not all going to visit family and friends right now, but when a very first day born infant is crying, they're upset because they're no longer in that nice little soft warm space with the heartbeat soothing them, and they're you swaddle them up so that their arms flailing around doesn't startle them. But one of the things that works extremely well is if you take a very young infant and you put on music that has a beat to it, not like crazy. I know maybe different children will like a crazy beat and some will like a calmer beat, but if you put on a piece of music that's got a nice steady beat about the heart rate speed, and you move with the child to that beat, it is amazing to watch. That fussy child will, it's almost get this look in their eyes, like, whoa, and everything feels like it makes sense again. It's like it's connecting. That's how powerful music is. It's like it's connecting the auditory and the sense, and I'm not sure exactly what the vestibular senses. It's connecting those two senses together for them, which, the first day they're out of the womb, the whole place is, this is crazy, I want to go back. But by taking their two senses and making them make sense together, you get a calmness of the brain. And that happens, day one of infancy. The same thing happens as we age.
Yeah, that was a great observation. So it looks like, art speaks to us as very, very young people and also very, very old people, very effectively. The other point you were making was about the stories last time, that stories with really philosophical meanings in it are, 2-year-olds will just eat it up, and they will get it. They will get it at that form. So yeah, it's that's a great testament to the value of art. If a 1-day-old and a 99-year-old can enjoy it very easily. All right, folks, this was just amazing. So Rob, Sherri, Joia, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. This was just incredible conversation. See you in a week. Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.